flag on there, Scott?
Oh yeah. Hey George, can you make Nicole and I co-hosts?
Oh yeah.
And George, can you play the Star Spangled Banner on the guitar? Come on, Jimmy, do it, Jimmy. All right. Yes. Let's all start. Pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United States of America
and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation,
under
under God,
indivisible,
with liberty and justice for all. All right, Linda, can you do a roll call, please?
Yes. Trustee Rodriguez.
Here.
Trustee Jackson Miller.
Here.
Trustee Izant Gonzalez.
Here.
Trustee Friedman.
Present.
Trustee Donnelly.
Present.
Thank you.
Next, is there a motion to adopt the agenda as it stands?
I'll make the motion. Carolyn.
Carolyn first.
I'll second. Amanda.
Amanda. First and second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None. Public communications. Do we have anybody out there who wish to speak on anything that is not on the agenda at this time?
I have nothing that I've received.
Okay.
I have nothing on text.
Sorry,
We didn't get. We didn't.
Zoom if that's what you're waiting for.
Oh, no, hold on. No, nothing on email.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to move on to presentations, and this is a discussion regarding racial justice and education equity. And Scott, do you want to make the introduction?
I would be honored to.
Okay.
So we are joined tonight by Nicole Anderson. We'll later be joined by her colleague, Dr. Shelley Holt. And this is the work that we have geared up to dig into. As you know, the work really started with you all and with our Teachers Association. And it became very apparent early on that this should be our primary focus for the year. And I just feel so lucky as a superintendent that worked out. Unfortunate that it took some of the circumstances and events that we all saw on the news to get there, but sometimes the catalyst is the catalyst, and the important thing is how we respond to it. I also feel very lucky having gone through the AXA Equity Institute with our board member Jen was also in that same institute. We were able to work with Nicole Anderson, and we found her to be not only knowledgeable, but also very engaging in terms of being able to meet everybody where they're at in this journey of racial equity. And so, as you know, we're really approaching this on 3 tracks, one with our administrative council, one with a task force that's been formed. Both of those groups have already met and started the work. And tonight I'm very excited to be with the board as you engage in this work yourselves. And so with that, I will turn it over to Nicole. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. And hello, fabulous, fearless board members of SoCal. I just appreciate being in your presence, and just don't take this lightly, working with governance teams and doing this very important work. Good to see you again, George, as well. Carolyn, good to see you again. I know we got to hang out. Amanda, hello, there's George. Jen, good to see you too. And just want to appreciate meeting all of you for the first time as well. This is truly an honor to do this work. Just a little tiny bit about myself. Again, I'll be joined by Dr. Shelley Holt, who's one of my associates. And she'll be partnering to facilitate the work with all 3 of the groups as well. But in particular, I come to you as a former teacher, a former principal, assistant principal, vice principal, a little bit of everything besides middle school. I skipped that process because I just think takes a different person to deal with middle schoolers. But I did the elementary side as a principal and also was a vice principal, assistant principal for high school. I had the pleasure of working at a school named after my grandfather in Vallejo, which is called Jesse Bethel High School. Not sure if you've ever heard of that. But that high school is now in year 22, if I'm not mistaken, because I actually was able to be there to open it up as a teacher. And my grandfather did a lot of firsts for African Americans in Vallejo, first school board president. So this is near and dear work to me. Also was the first African American president for CSBA. For those of you that love your CSBA membership, he actually was very historical in that organization. And also was the first African American chemist on Mare Island Naval Shipyard, if you're familiar with that. So that was a big deal. It also is the reason that he's not here with us anymore, because he was exposed to asbestos. He worked on the submarine. So I say all that to say that I'm here standing on his shoulders. And this particular work requires us to acknowledge those whose shoulders we stand on. It requires us to acknowledge the land we stand on. And it requires us to just humble ourselves and acknowledge the pain in this work, but also the opportunity to do phenomenal work. Scott, I appreciate you acknowledging just some of the hard reality of some of the events that have unfolded that really sparked this work. But as you also know, we met a couple years back and we were trying to do this work then. So it's definitely not a knee-jerk response, but also it's an opportunity to leverage the work of a governance team and wanting to really be intentional about addressing racial equity. And so I just appreciate all of you for your vision, for your intentionality, and for giving some special space on the agenda to do this work. As governance team, there's a lot you have to oversee. And so we will talk about that today, by the way, as well as in the next 3 study sessions together. But just want to ensure that you know who this strange lady is that Scott brought to the space. And just again, I'm honored to share. I'll share a little bit of my story throughout the time. And when Dr. Holt jumps on, I'll make sure you get to meet her as well. She has an amazing story. I did, again, meet Scott through the AXA realm. So for those of you that are familiar with the Association of California School Administrators, I held that equity position and had the pleasure of meeting great superintendents and administrators and all kinds of folks around the state of California. And so now that we come full circle, what's so exciting is that as governance teams and superintendents together, right, there is amazing work that can be done with a powerful group like you. I can't say that enough. There is amazing work that can be done. There's a culture that you can establish that will be your legacy, even beyond, you know, the elections, right? And the terms after the terms after the terms, right? The reality is this is legacy work. This is bigger than just check the box we did 4 study sessions. And so I'm excited for you for that you can create a culture that no matter who comes on the board, they recognize this is who we are. This is the work we're doing. And so today I want to walk you through that. And the way I want to do that is one, ensure that we all have a chance to recognize that I am going to facilitate this work as a conversation with the board. I know that often like executive cabinet, you know, is a part of this work and kind of an extension of Scott's staff. But everything I'll share is going to be in the space of the governance team. So I want to make sure that that's clear as people watch this, right, live stream the community, but also any staff members, teachers, anyone who's going to be watching. I want to make sure people understand this is a study session for the board because this is sacred time that you need to be able to study the issue of racial equity. So I just want to make sure that's clear because sometimes people will want to shift and talk about like staff responsibilities and it will happen, it'll be part of the conversation, but everything I talk about tonight is through the lens of governance, okay? So I know you all know each other well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing get to know you activities just yet. However, we are going to do some collaborative work together, and I do want to share my screen to share a slide, a few slides to as talking points. I do want to make sure you all have access to your handouts. I know I shared them as a Google folder, and what I will do is continue to share those documents with you as resources along the way. So we'll try to time them as well as we can for your board meetings, but sometimes there are resources that come up that I'll just put in the folder and I'll allude to those each study session as well. But what you see here is my slideshow. I don't think, Scott, it was in the folder when I shared it with you. So if you want to share it with folks afterwards, it's fine. A lot of times with boards, I don't share the slides ahead of time, and most people, it's not a problem, but just want to make sure you know that it is in the folder if you all want to refer to this later, okay? So what I'm going to do is I am going to push the presentation mode. There it is. All right. So something I have shared with leaders all over the state and in several states, organizations, nonprofits, police departments, you name it. I still kind of share this kind of facilitation lens through the lens of educational leaders, and that is you as a governance team. And my quote that was inspired in me about 2014 when I first started working at AXA was educational leaders. We cannot close the educational gaps that we see in our schools if we don't close the one in our minds first. And that is really the spirit by which I facilitate, and that I try to share this message with you as leaders, that the work we're going to do together requires us to do some awareness building, some mindset work first before we can actually change policy and practice. And so it's really important that we recognize how valuable this time is to be aware of what we may not know, but also to really engage in understanding what others know and how we can meet people along the way to address the bigger issues of closing educational equity gaps. So the way I like you to think about this is through these 3 questions that I share with lots of leaders to just give you food for thought. And in particular, these 3 questions are: who wants to lead? I'm sorry, let me back up. Who wants change? Who wants to change? And who wants to lead change? And those are 3 very different questions that I ask governance teams to think about. And one, if you notice the way people have responded in the image about who wants change, like everybody wants change, right? Like everybody's really energetic about this work. Lots of districts all over the nation are really being more intentional about racial equity work. There is resolutions, you name it. There's a lot of energy in this work across industries, by the way. It's not even just education. But the reality is when we shift the question and say, who wants to change? Notice what happens. The hands go down now, right? Like, no, wait, I want to change. I want the system to change. I want those people to change. I want everything to change, right? But we don't, when we say, do I want to change? A lot of times our hands go down. So I'm going to challenge you to think about, how do we keep our hands up even with that one, right? Who wants to change? Me, I want to change, right? I want to look inside. I want to look inwardly as an organization to make sure we are part of the change. But then the last question, notice the response. Who wants to lead the change? Crickets, right? You don't hear anybody, you don't see anybody. And again, this is the hardest part of racial equity work, is leading the change. This is where we have to take a risk. I always say to people, this is where you risk your job, right? You literally have to risk, like, I might lose my job over this work, because this work is not about check the box. It's not about just change of policy. This is about system change. This is about people work. And a lot of times, if you're in a political space like a governance team, this is really hard because everyone is not going to be a fan of this work. And that's what we have to get ahead of. And so my goal between now and study session 4 is that as we ask these questions, right, who wants change, who wants to change, who wants to lead the change, that our hands are up as SoCal's board, right? Our hands are up for all 3 of the questions. And if you are like, oh, I'm not sure where I fit in all this, this is why we're doing the study session together, so that we can create space for you to be effective with your governance practices, but doing that with a racial equity lens. So as we jump in, one thing that's important is, again, I share with you my story, right? My why I'm here. This is my grandfather, by the way, the person I mentioned, Mr. Jesse Bethel. And I want you to think about your why as a governance team member. One is, why did you even sign up to be a board member, right? Why are you in this thing called education? Whether it's something you do for a living or you're just a governance team member and you have a different career. But think about your why. Why did you do this? Why be a governance team member? Why be a board member in public education? During a pandemic, when racial dust has been kicked up. Some of you are actually asking yourself, why did I sign up, right? So I want you to do just take a moment, just jot it down on a piece of paper real quick. What is your why? My why is my grandfather, right? I'm standing on his shoulders. I believe this is the seed that was planted in me. He provided me with an opportunity that I'm eternally grateful for. So part of my why is to fulfill something I think I'm obligated to do, is to continue the legacy of my grandfather. But what is your why? So for board members, why did you become a board member? Why racial equity work as a board member? As a superintendent, Scott, why be a superintendent? Why did you become one? What is your why? Your North Star. I'm gonna give you about another 45 seconds to jot that down. It's a great strategy, by the way, for racial equity leaders to journal and reflect. Give ourselves the gift of reflection. All right. About 15 more seconds. Finish your thoughts. All right, so I'm going to do this. I'm just going to do a quick whip around. And I'm going to ask that each of you share your why in 1 to 2 words. Okay, 1 to 2 words. Your why.
Support.
All right, so Ted said support.
The budget.
Budget.
I'll just say kids.
Kids. Is that Carolyn? Carolyn or Caroline? You told me this.
Carolyn.
It is Carolyn. Okay. Kids.
Student stories.
Student stories. All right, go ahead and unmute yourself. I'm writing and listening. What did I grab? Who am I missing? I got
Amanda.
1, 2. What am I missing? Yeah, Amanda.
Amanda's
you're
not good at
thinking.
making things short.
Amanda's thinking like, how do I?
How do I? Give me a sec.
That's all right. Scott, we'll just see you. Go ahead.
dun, dun.
Go ahead, Scott. What about
Oh.
you?
Full potential.
Full potential.
All right, I can do it. Access and equity.
Access, equity. All right, did I get everybody? Did I miss anyone? All right, perfect. And I'm gonna go ahead and ask everyone else who's on the call. I know Linda, if you want to jump in as well, George, if you want to share as well. I want to make sure everyone shares for this particular one, if you'd like to participate.
I would. Life learner.
Life learner. Love it.
I'll go. Continuous learning.
Continuous learning. Love it. All right, go ahead and unmute yourself. Who am I missing? There you are. Okay, Jessica, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I'm sharing screen and trying to see you all. So go ahead and jump in if you hadn't gone.
I would like to share, and I think mine is change.
Change. Powerful. Thank you. Change. Got it. All right, did I get everyone? Unmute if I missed you, because I'm sharing screen, so I don't see you all per se. All right, perfect. So your why, your story, your North Star. And I know you gave just a few words to describe that. As we get ready to go through this work together, not just tonight, but throughout the journey, I'm going to ask you to keep that journaling entry, that story you just wrote down. But I want you to keep this at the forefront, especially when we get to topics that may be challenging, that may be uncomfortable, where I'm going to push you to be a little uncomfortable, but definitely in a safe way. But always remember your why. Very important as we're doing this work as a governance team, because your why is going to be what's going to ground you in this work. Being politically in a space where you are elected and you are in, you have constituents that you have to, meet their needs and rightfully should. The reality is you're going to get pushback in this work. Everyone's not going to agree. And there are going to be some uncomfortable moments, and you're going to have to make some decisions that are going to be tough. I call them the crossroads, right? And so I want to always remind you to keep that North Star in front of you, because this work will be similar to the tree blowing in behind me. Is this going to be wind? And it's going to blow different directions. COVID-19 is a part of the wind, right? COVID-19 will not last forever. We'll all say that out loud. COVID-19 will not last forever, right? It's a breeze, it'll pass, right? But what we don't want to do is forget our North Star. We don't want to forget our why. We don't want to forget our purpose of being here. Racial dust has been kicked up, and racial dust will start to settle. And it'll be easy to forget about why we're doing this work, because people aren't going to be as energetic, right? That change that people desire may not be as strong as it is now. How do we stay focused on our why? Priorities of a board will come up. You're gonna have lots of initiatives that you'll have to kind of think about, you know, things that may be more urgent, other things that may not, but a lot of initiatives and things you have to prioritize. How do you prioritize knowing your why, your purpose? And individually, each of you have an individual purpose and a why, but collectively, we wanna make sure that we understand our collective why, which we're gonna talk about shortly. So before I jump in, I think I saw my colleague, Dr. Holt, jump on, but I don't know if I see her anymore. And so did I miss her, Scott? You shook your head. I thought I saw her.
She did come on board and I admitted her, but now I'm not seeing her in the participant list.
Scared her away. Okay, I'm glad she got the new link, so that was great. Okay. All right, so one of the things I want to do to ensure that this work is very effective is to make sure there's safe space. And I don't skip this step with any client I ever work with, that with this work, it is critical that we have safety, that everyone feels that they are, have a place in this work, that they're not going to be judged or be attacked because of a belief system or a perspective, that everybody's on their racial equity journey, and wherever people are, that's where we meet them at. And I say that because if the work is not in a safe space, it won't advance at all. So safety is critical. We don't want to skip this step as even a governance team when we talk about as a group that's powerful, right? We have to remember that everybody doesn't have power. And so we have to create safety for others to engage in this work too. Even when they might mess up, right? They're not sure how to do this work. We still want to honor that safety. But safety is not the same thing as being comfortable. And I want to make sure we're really clear that safety and discomfort are two different things. And it's important that we have a safe space for everyone, but that people recognize to move to brave space, meaning we're going to do something. As a governance team, we're going to have policy that is going to make radical changes to close racial equity gaps. That's brave space. And that requires some discomfort. So these 4 agreements that are inspired by Glenn Singleton are really powerful in setting safe space, because what it does is helps us really stay centered when the work gets messy and uncomfortable, because it will get that way. So the 4 agreements remind us to stay engaged, even when it's uncomfortable, experience discomfort, even when we don't like discomfort, pushing ourselves to grow, pushing ourselves to embrace discomfort. Honestly, this is be comfortable with discomfort, right? Always being okay with this not quite being what the norm is. And also knowing that we're not really doing the work if it is comfortable. You have to beware of quietness, right? Beware of complacency, beware of there's nothing going on, there's no pushback, because that means that we're not pushing the system, we're not interrupting. So it's okay, discomfort is a good thing. Also speaking our truth. So what it means to speak our truth, sharing our perspective, ensuring that everyone has a place in this work, knowing that your truth may be different from my truth, and that may be uncomfortable, but that's part of the agreement, to speak truth, because that's where people get to learn. This is where differences are valued. We can respond more effectively to differences, but we have to know people's truth, people's story. And last but not least, expect and accept non-closure. So we're going to end today and at 7:30, and I'm not sure, we started a little late, so not sure if we go beyond 7:30, but I'll do a time check in a little bit to make sure. But we're going to end today. And we're going to have a lot of non-closure. We're going to have lots of research and lots of questions. We're going to have some reflection, a little bit of discomfort, emotionally, mentally, because I'm going to push you to think about how do we ensure we're more effective as a governance team? How do we do that with a racial equity lens? That is a lot of non-closure, because we're not going to be able to address something like institutional racism in one night, in 2 hours of Zoom. Honestly, we may not even be able to interrupt and really reshape the system in the next year or 2 or 20. It's a journey, because we are talking about hundreds of years of policies and practices in the school system that require us to recognize that we're going to have non-closure. My grandfather had non-closure, and that's part of why my why is that non-closure. I want to pick that up and continue so that there's closure for the work that he started that maybe he didn't get to see. He didn't actually even get to see the high school that was erected in his name, right? He got to do the groundbreaking. He picked the colors based on his fraternity, but he never got to see the building, unfortunately. And so that non-closure is part of his work, right? It's a lifelong work and journey. So with these 4 agreements, how do we feel about this as a governance team? I'm going to share these each time we come together, but how do we feel about these? Do you think these are something we can agree to and kind of push ourselves? Okay. All right.
To the four points you have right here.
Yep.
Okay.
Stay engaged, experience discomfort, speak your truth, expect and accept non-closure.
So as you're presenting, do you want us to interrupt you with questions, or do you want to wait till you ask for questions?
You know, it's a little bit of both. I typically ask you questions. Since we don't do breakout rooms for, board meetings, what you'll find is there may be something that comes up. And so absolutely, this is your session. This is your study session.
Okay.
Jump in, ask questions. But I will also be asking you questions as well. So we'll make it as interactive as possible. Yeah, good question.
Perfect.
All right, so we're all good with the 4 agreements. All right, good. And I'm going to keep on reminding you, these are great self-checks though. So again, I'm not going to police you on how engaged you are. That's for you to determine. Zoom exhaustion is real in the evening. So I want to make sure that you recognize how to take care of yourselves, stretch, do your mindfulness, get something to drink, whatever you have to do to ensure that you can stay fully engaged and lean into this work, especially when it's uncomfortable. And that's a really important agreement as a governance team where you represent power. And with power means that you have privilege, power and privilege. And what that means is when I'm uncomfortable, I have the privilege to disengage. And that's a really important aspect of these 4 agreements, because as an equity leader, as a person who can navigate the system, I have power, I influence people. And if I get tired and I just decide, I don't want to do this anymore, I have the power to say, I don't want to do this anymore. But I call myself on these 4 agreements because it's not about me. It's about serving people who have less power than me, who I can advocate for. So I use these to hold myself accountable, especially when I'm uncomfortable or emotionally just kind of in a bad space. I have to remember, I agreed to stay engaged. I agreed to experience discomfort, right? Those are all the things that really help us to stay focused on this work. I appreciate that. So in your resources, your handouts, you received an article called The Water of System Change. Did any of you have a chance to look at that just yet? And if you didn't, it's okay. It's okay. All right, so Phil did. Good.
Did you email these handouts? Because I think I have something different, I think.
Ted, I shared a folder with you.
Yeah,
There was a document that kind of outlined the work, and then there was a folder of resources.
yeah.
And there were actually 2 of these systems, water things in there.
Yep. So Phil, what you saw is there's an article and then there's an action planning template, which we're going to use later down the road when we do our action planning together. But yes, there were 2. They look very similar, but they go hand in hand. So yeah. And Ted, no worries if you didn't get to look through it. Part of tonight was to upload it. Yeah, he's like, really?
Was it emailed, Scott, or did you email us the folder?
Yes, and I just linked it in the chat.
All right, thank you.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect. And
It was
so
in an email called resources for the meeting.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Ted, you know what? This is the first part of inequities is your email is discriminating against your superintendent. We got to work on that.
Okay, I remember these folders. I think I
Not
saw
like he's the
squirrel.
president or
Sorry.
anything.
There we go.
All right, there we go. Perfect. So again, I'm alluding to this particular article because it really sets the tone for how we approach racial equity work. And I call it reimagining governance, right? We've learned to do governance. You probably have all gone through NIC trainings and you have a real sense of what governance is. And so I want to push you to reimagine governance and add this equity lens. And of course, even more add a racial equity lens. So we'll unpack that together. But the article has a really interesting context to it. It talks about system change. And as you read through it, you're going to see it talks about different levels in the system to consider when we want to make lasting change, and what those conditions may be that we have to examine. And so I like to pull out this fish story in the beginning of the article, which really talks about these 2 fish in this body of water, and I call it the fish who was more woke than the other one, right? There's a fish who comes up and says, hey, how's the water, right? And the next fish looks back and says, what's water? And so if you let that sit for a minute and really think about what's water, this is the work as educational leaders we have to do, is constantly be on a journey of recognizing what's water. And the water I'm referring to is this body of water called public education that you all signed up to be a part of. And often what happens is in this body of water, there's conditions that exist that we're not aware of. There's conditions that exist that may not be healthy for all fish, including our children, our families, and sometimes us as staff members who work in the system. There are often conditions we're just not aware of. And so some of those things that what blinds us is lack of awareness. We'll talk about some of those things in a moment. But it's important we recognize as governance team members, we're gonna have to pause for a moment and kind of pull ourselves out of the water for a minute. We've been in the water for a long time, whether you're in education as a full-time job or you're just in this governance space and you have a different career path. The reality is that you've been in the system of education for a long time. If you can't remember, I want you to think back to kindergarten, maybe TK, maybe preschool, but you've been in school a long time. And the reality is that you go on to college or you go on to some higher ed, you go on to some learning experience. And so we've been in these waters called public education and called education and schooling for a long time. And it's important we recognize some of the things that we didn't recognize. As a former teacher, when I first started at age 22, I did not realize things that I know now. I was just told, here's a book, here's a key, go to that classroom and teach. And I just did what I was taught to do, right? I modeled what my teachers did. All the kids sat in straight rows. I was the giver of all knowledge. And I graded the way my teachers graded. I even created tests the way my teachers did, because that's all I knew until I went to professional learning, until I had mentorship and coaching, and I started to be more aware of, oh, that's what water is. And so it's important we recognize that part of the barriers to governance with an equity lens is not recognizing the waters we swim in as a governance team. So I want to make sure that you really have a good sense of what that looks like. And as we unpack the work, I'm going to keep reminding you about these waters. And as you read the article, it's going to all make sense of the examples that are given around how do we examine the conditions in our organization, in our district, and then recognize how some of those policies that we've created, some of the practices that we follow, that they may have not always landed well for some of our kids and families who actually equity has not been their experience. But sometimes we don't even know it because we haven't had that lived experience and we just haven't had that exposure. So we're going to practice that through the lens of our water system change article, which is also going to help lead us into action planning. What do we do as we move forward? So before I move on, I see my fearless colleague, Dr. Holt, is able to join all the way from Michigan, USA. Dr. Holt, do you want to do a quick intro as we get ready to transition? This is the fearless governance team of Soquel Elementary School District.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me, and my apologies. I had a panel that I just got off of regarding girls and policing. So that was a fun one, right? And then we're transitioning to this. So my name is Dr. Shirley Jones Holt, and I am a racial and educational impact anthropologist. I was a superintendent of the 14th largest district in the state of Michigan. I started out as a teacher over 20 years ago, and exactly what Nicole just mentioned was my experience as well, kind of coming in and kind of having the revelation over years about what's been happening in education and that there is a different way to do this work. And so I'm very excited to be here with you, and you'll hear more about my story as we work together. But I'm just honored to be with you on this journey, and it is a journey. It's going to challenge each and every one of us. We've all walked it and are still walking it, and so you're not alone with that. And I'm just grateful to be here with you all through this, and excited to see the work that's going on. I will say your team that we were with the other day, you have an amazing team. And I say that, and I don't. You'll learn this about me. I don't give fluff comments. It's just not in me. But you really do. Seeing the people that Mr. Turnbull has put together was absolutely phenomenal. So we're very excited about this work with your district, and let's just say they don't hold back either. So that was it was awesome to be with this group, and I'm excited and honored to join you.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I see it's kind of late for you too.
Just a little. Yeah, we always tease Dr. Holt about having lots of Starbucks. Is that intentional that you put that you're ahead of us?
No, no, we were doing the clock. Remember, I have 4 kids, so I've been doing virtual schooling all day long and
Okay.
buy an actual clock so that we could do time with the 4th and the 2nd graders. So that's why this was up, was because I was doing time earlier
That's
today.
fine. No.
No,
We tend not to be big fans of analog, huh?
Right.
They're just like, Mom, I can look it up on the phone. I'm like, yeah, but you got to learn how to do a clock. Just understand, you got to know where these arms are.
Oh, so with
Thank
that, as we get ready to transition, I wanted to share a little context about the importance of when I mentioned about our why, and also us being the fish in this system called public education, that you are one of those fish swimming in this body of water. And we're swimming up with a whole lot of other fish. But what I want to do is just have you for a moment step out of that body of water so we can examine it. And part of stepping out is examining ourselves and looking at who are we as these fish in the water? Like, how does this impact us, our decision making? But who am I? And so the way I want you to do this is through a reflective question that I want you to consider. And in that reflective question is the concept or the question here about your personal identity. And so as you think about how to answer this question, how does the intersection of your personal and professional identity impact how you lead for educational equity, in particular racial equity in education? And so as you think about the intersection, well, what does that mean, Nicole? Well, personally, this is who I am. I am an African-American woman. I'm a mother. I'm a female. I speak English. I'm going on 45 years old in exactly a month. I am middle class. I'm a Christian. I'm a heterosexual woman. I believe I'm physically able, but as I'm getting older, I realize I can't play basketball like I used to when I had a scholarship to go to Oregon State, go Beavs. I cannot physically play as well as I used to, but I am physically able. So as I think about my cultural identity, my story behind all of that, it is how I enter the world. It's how I see the world. It's how I take in information, how I interact with people. It impacts how I make decisions in terms of who I am. Now, as a consultant, where I am in a professional space, that intersects all the time. How I present, how I interact with people. There's always this intersectionality. Like, I never really get to separate myself. And so as governance team members, you also have a very similar experience, that as a person, you are who you are. You represent, you identify in some of these ways. You may identify with bubbles that don't exist on the screen. But the reality is you are a person who has an identity, which is beautiful. It's a great story. And you also have a sense of what we call bias that comes with these bubbles that we identify with. Like, we all have these biases. And so those bring challenges to the work, but it's my perspective, it's my story, it's my truth. And so then you come into the governance team space. Now you're a governance member, you're part of a board, not just an individual, but you still bring your individuality, your personal identity. So as that intersection happens, I want you to think about how that impacts how you lead for racial equity, because each of you may have a really different experience. So I want you to take a moment. You may want to write for a second to think about how you respond, but I want to just open it up to see what comes up for you as you think about this particular question. This is going to be instrumental as you come to moving your work around racial equity and just really reflecting on who am I and what is my intersectionality in terms of personal and professional identity and how that impacts my role in leading for racial equity. So I'm just going to pause, let you think for a minute, and then I'm going to open up for a little discussion. Then we're going to move right into conversation about governance. Yay. How does the intersection, your personal and professional identity, impact how you lead for racial equity? It's not a normal question board members get all the time, by the way. It's very important because it happens all the time. Any decision you make is always impacted by who you are as a person. So does anyone want to be bold and speak their truth and share how you might have answered this question?
I'll go. So
Okay.
I'm a strategist, I'm curious, and I'm an introvert.
So tell me a little more, Phil, how does that, who you are, how it intersects with you being a governance team member, a board member, how does that impact how you lead for racial equity?
Well, not sure about that last question because you haven't really defined racial equity yet. So don't know how,
Well, let me say this, you caught on to that. Based on how you define racial equity, because that's the work we have here today, obviously, as a board, we're wanting to unpack it. But based on your understanding of what racial equity is, how do you feel like your personal identity, how it intersects with your role as a governance team member, how might it impact?
So I would look at the defined problem based on the data and strategize a solution and then move on to the next problem.
Powerful. So I heard data. Everybody notate that. Racial equity leaders absolutely look at data. Absolutely. That's a great strategy. Anyone else want to jump in and share? I think Amanda has something to say. I'm reading her mind, and I think I'm reading well, huh, Amanda? You got something.
You like how I'm leaning in.
You are leaning in.
I'm leaning in. Let's see, in terms of identity, especially around this work, it really comes from being a mother, being a lawyer, a person who's always been very, very focused on justice.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Just how does that intersectionality, how does it impact how you lead for racial equity?
Well, that is certainly a work in progress, but I know I think although the data is important for me, it's on the other side, it's very much the empathy, the understanding, the stories, hearing what kids and other folks are going through, and thinking about, what can we do within our system to, lessen the impact and
powerful.
Feel have fewer of these heartbreaking stories of the injustices that that folks are experiencing.
Got it. Thank you for that. I appreciate you speaking your truth.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I love your connection, by the way, to your other job, right? Like your governance team is one moment in time, but also as a lawyer, focusing on advocating and justice is big. So thank you. Phil, I appreciate your connection to using the data, right, to address racial equity, which is important. And some of you might be thinking like, what kind of question is this, Nicole Anderson? Where is this coming from? And
so I think what's going to end up here is we all have different personality types, and yay. And so kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons team, everybody has their superpower. And so we'll sit in a meeting and things will bounce around like a ping pong ball. And then we all have to then be comfortable with something. So we bring whatever it is, especially our personalities, but also, what's in the noggin, and usually come out with something okay.
Powerful.
I just learned 2 things about Phil tonight I didn't know. I did not know Phil was an introvert, and I did not know he liked Dungeons and Dragons. And I want to say thank you for sharing. I already feel more connected to you.
Just like that. Workshop over, right?
I know, everybody's blown away. What, Phil's an introvert?
I've been telling you guys this for years.
But you're coming out and being vocal about it.
That's comedy.
So you must love the COVID thing.
It's the coffee talking. It's the coffee.
It's the coffee. Blame it on the coffee, Phil. Well, I will say this, that question I call a loaded question, and it's complex, but it's very much a real need for us to reflect on this, is that who we are as people shapes how we make decisions. It shapes our biases, it shapes our values. And as a governance team, you come together as individuals, but you make decisions as a team. And so one, understanding, again, go back to my why, right? Who I am is typically, when I describe, I'm an African-American woman, right? And I gave you all these spaces that I identify, but remember I told you my why. Can you see the connection to my why? So how I make decisions, how I advocate for people who are less fortunate, the way I see the world is through my lens. And that may not be the same as someone else. But the reality is, as a governance team, you all have to know each other's why. And I hope that you spend more time with each other individually, having your little 2 meetings that you do, your 2 people meetings. You don't break the Brown Act, of course, but spending time making sure you know each other's why. Because when we attack racial equity work, what's going to happen is your personal identity is going to intersect with being a board member. And you're going to have to make decisions, and I call them crossroad decisions, literally, that are going to possibly come up against your core values, your core beliefs. But also there may be someone else who has different core values and core beliefs who's on your team. And there are going to be moments when you have to vote on something, right? There's going to be moments that you have to make decisions, and without knowing people's why, and also without creating a culture on the board of understanding that, look, we may not always agree, but whatever we decide, we're going to get behind. And it's important to understand our why. You are going to make some decisions, and this question is going to come back to you, because you're only going to know, like, oh, I'm really challenged with this right now. I'm not sure. I'm afraid to talk about racism. I'm afraid to speak up about this issue. I don't know how to respond to this parent that's pushing back. And the reality is that this question is going to come back to you, because you're always in this crossroad of who I am as a person, but then I'm here as a board member. And that's going to be really critical. For Scott as a superintendent, like lots of decisions he makes all the time, right? And those are going to be moments that will be challenging, even in the midst of doing the right work. You're going to find that. So I want you to keep that in mind, because in this next conversation, as we talk about governance as a team, it is important that we do value your individuality. Okay, that's very important. It's important to recognize that you bring value to this board, but ultimately it is a team. So any decisions we make around racial equity is not my individual agenda, right? If I was on your board right now, I'm the African-American woman, absolutely. My bias is gonna play out, and I'm gonna ask for what Phil said. I wanna see the data around your African-American kids. Even if it's 2 in this school and it's 5 in another school, and then it's 20 in a different one, I wanna see the data. Now, why? Part of it is, yeah, I'm gonna have a favor towards African-American kids. Why? Because that's who I was, right? I was that fish in water. Right? So I'm concerned about the experiences of the kids, but also I'm raising 3 kids. I'm married to an African-American man. That's who I am. But I also recognize what Phil said, is that my bias is not what drives my agenda. What drives the agenda is the data. And if I pull up the data and see that, oh, we have some racial equity gaps where we see our African-American kids are not being served well in the system, that's my agenda. I got to address this because the data is clear. It's not about Nicole anymore. It's about, this is the data. So I really appreciate you all being thoughtful about this, because as we go into effective governance, that is what's going to be critical to move this work, is effective governance. Dr. Holt, did you want to jump in before I jump into this next, their assessment to see where they are?
Oh, sorry. I also want to point out that, sometimes we may not know where people are coming from, because we don't know everyone's story. And so that makes it even more critical for everyone to understand people's story and not make assumptions about that. I'm not going to go too much into my story, but a lot of assumptions are made about me when people look at me. When people look at me, they don't see a woman who speaks fluent Spanish. And then the minute I start speaking Spanish, they start wondering, well, wait a minute, where did she come from? What kind of Spanish is she? And when people look at me, they don't see someone who came from upper middle class. Yes, I was raised by nannies. They don't see that. So I don't have some of the same stories. And so when I come into situations, I bring a lot of that with me. What is it that you are bringing with you that sometimes you either need to check at the door, sometimes you need to just acknowledge that it's there and it's not going anywhere, so I just need to make sure it's in check. Not necessarily I can leave it, but it's what I need to check. And also, how can we continue to use the data to move these various racial equity issues forward. When the data shows it, am I going to be able to accept it? Or will I have my own biases that are bringing in other facets where a conversation I often hear is, well, there's only 4 or 5 kids. It's only, well, what if it was your child and it was only your, and so, you know, a lot of things are going to come up as we start entering this racial equity conversation. And so continue to challenge yourself. I appreciate the introversion. I'm an introvert as well, Mr. Rodriguez, so I can completely understand that. But I present as an extrovert as a consultant when I'm at work. An introverted person who talks all day long isn't going to make sense. You know, but what you will know is I will shut it down, shut it up, and that's where I get, you know, my, I get fed by the time alone. But, you know, it doesn't always present itself as such. And so the intersection of your personal and professionalism, Ms. Anderson is talking about, it's going to come up. And when it does, just know that if we say, hey, are your personal and your professional intersecting right now? And let's talk about that. You'll know a little bit more about what we mean. Because that's kind of a safe way to say, oh, hold on, let me back up for a moment and see where I'm coming from on this one. And might I have some biases that I haven't worked through just yet?
Thank you. As we've talked through that a little bit, is there any other thoughts that come up? Because I know that question is a very loaded question that is hard sometimes to understand, but any questions or thoughts that are coming up now that you've had a little bit more discussion about it?
About the intersection?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a long question. If you could identify with Spiff the Spaceman, that's me from Calvin and Hobbes, and that was me in school. I was always off in another world. So that's why I like policies, because policies are short and to the point. I could read and, you know, right away. So I mean, I'm around a lot of educators, and I have a high school degree, and I always had, you know, some issues with learning and this and that, and reading books. But you know, as far as me, I mean, I'm a father. I have a daughter who blew through UCLA and Stanford, is now a school teacher. I have one that's, you know, in Santa Barbara who, well, she took a gap year. So I told her, if you're going to do a gap year, take off to somewhere. She took off to Australia. I said, serve first, work second. You have the rest of your life to work. And then now she's in school, and she's finishing school. And I mean, my daughters are moving on in education, which I'm really am happy for them. But, you know, but that's how I look at myself as a father. You know, I've been very adventurous with them, road trips. I coached. I was a coach, and you know, and also I feel that I'm, you know, one lucky SOB. I mean, I just, before the meeting, I ran down to the ocean and jumped in the water, went for a swim, and I can come back here. That's what my nose is draining a little bit still. But I mean, I'm just really one lucky person. Now, as far as the intersection as a board member and equity, is that I grew up in LA area where there was still some segregation in the 60s. And my mom would invite the kids on the other side of the track, which, as you know, literally it was, you know, over to, you know, the feed them or I mean, cookies. And I, to this day, I am friends with all my African American friends. I'm 60 years old. They're 60 years old, and we're all still close to one another. And, you know, and thanks to social media too. And as my girls are growing, they are very acceptant of people and their personalities. And I think they could be a little bit more acceptant than I am sometimes. You know, and so with that, you know, the intersection, if I'm making sense, is that, you know, as a father, that's why I say support. You know, I didn't come onto the board to make huge changes. We have fine educators who will lead us. I want to support our educators. I want to support their adventure to education. And so if I'm making sense, that's where the intersection goes.
No, I appreciate that, Ted, because I think that it's important that people know your why, and your lens of you governing is through the lens of a father who has children who have been successful, right? And actually are in education. And also through the lens, I heard you also share your own story of you were one of those fish in water where the school system didn't serve you well. And that's what I took from that story, which is it's a piece of you that's like, I'm going to support others, right? Because there are kids who are also not feeling like they're always been successful in school. They may have struggled for a moment. You know, a lot of times, like I think about when I was in school, it's like fake engagement. I was there, but I was spacing out too. But I was taught, my grandfather was very clear, like, you better do well in school because he fought, bled, and died for me, right? So I faked engagement, but I was not fully engaged, and the system didn't always serve me well. So I love that you made that connection. And that often is what's going to happen is as we go into effective governance, you all are going to find that your personal story is what's going to impact what decisions you make. And some of these decisions will be very hard when we talk about interrupting racism. It's a big deal. It's policies and practices that have not been healthy for all children based on race and based on some of the intersectionality of kids, right? Which is also not just race, but then their socioeconomic status, right? And their language. There's going to be a lot that comes up. And again, everyone's not going to love this work. You would think people would, but they're not. But when they hear your story, when they hear your why, it's hard to combat that. So that's why I really appreciate you all sharing and want you to think about as you bring yourself to this work, you're going to always intersect. You are a person, but you're also a board member. And so I want you to remember this particular question is centered around having you reflect on that. And I recommend you go back to this as a journaling prompt for those of you that like to journal. Maybe it's once a week, once a month, or maybe it's in that moment when you have to make a really tough decision. Go back to that. So what I want to do is shift you into another piece of the agenda. I have had the pleasure of sharing this board assessment with several of our CSBA Equity Network board members. Another young lady out of Ohio, now in Tennessee, Deborah Keys Wright, has also worked with boards nationally. And one of the things that we found is that many boards don't do a real laser focused assessment on their effectiveness as a governance team. And so this particular tool was adapted from the Center for Public Education. And there's actually a copy of this board assessment as well as the full report that shares the 8 characteristics of effective boards. And one reason why it's so critical that you think about this as an equity-driven board is that you recognize that the key to effectively addressing educational equity gaps in schools, it starts with highly effective governance practices. And when we say highly, that means that there are some specific things that you have to think about, that basic structures, the culture of your board in order to take this work to the next level. So this particular board assessment, do you all have it handy in front of you? Because I know it's harder to see on the screen, so it might be helpful if you had it in front of you so you could see. I think I have not figured out how to make this bigger for you. I apologize. But what I want to do is, it is also in your Google folder in the handouts. And so if you go again, click on that particular link Scott has placed in the chat, you'll find it. It looks like that actually is the link to the document, if I'm not mistaken. But what I want you to do is, I want to have just a brief discussion with you about how often do you actually kind of assess your board governance? How often does that happen? And there's no right or wrong answer, by the way, but just curious about how often do you assess, like do a self-assessment of your governance as a team? Anybody?
When do we do the CSBA?
Yeah,
Once a year.
Yeah,
We do it every year.
For the last 4 years, it's been annually.
Good.
It's in March, February, March.
Good for you. Good.
I would trust Linda with every answer.
Don't trust you, right? You trust Linda. Yeah. Thanks, Linda, for keeping us together, huh? But this is an important question because when we talk about effective governance, it's hard to know we're effective if we don't measure our work and the impact of our work. So this is a great tool. And the way it's been adapted is to really help you think about an equity lens. So these 8 characteristics of effective boards is broken down in this way. So the first one, and I just want you all to just kind of like, shout out where you think you are, okay? No judgment, no actions taken today. It's just a discussion. when we talk about this first one, our school board commits to a vision for equity through high expectations for student achievement, quality instruction, and we define clear goals towards that vision. How do you think you are as a governance team on that? So vision for equity, high expectations for students. We have clear goals to get towards this vision. How do you think you are? Do you think you're effective on that? Somewhat, very effective, not effective? What do you think?
I think this group is very effective.
Okay. Phil, what about you?
Do we have a written equity vision statement?
Great question.
We do have that. I'm not sure that it has specific goals though. I would have to read it again, but I feel like we could have better goals perhaps.
And I heard Phil say equity statement, but then there's also a vision, right? Like, what does that mean? So statement often is infused in a vision, but that's a great question. So it sounds like we might be in a, like, kind of down the middle. We're somewhat effective, but we still have some revisiting to do of our statement. Maybe we need to evolve it. So we'll talk about that because that's one of our outcomes we'll actually have.
Well, we have it as part of our a policy, so maybe it doesn't qualify as an actual statement. I'm not sure.
All right. So you have an equity policy that you've adopted.
Yeah, but I do what Phil's like a big part of the work is, you know, if we did have if we were all looking at each of these statements with a similar equity definition, because in my mind, I'm thinking, you know, disrupting systems of oppression and like I have my working definition that I'm going and then maybe Phil has a different one and Amanda has a different one and Ted has a different one.
Right.
So just to honor that I get that like sticking point.
Yep.
That Phil's got with that.
Got it. So you have a policy, is what I think I heard Carolyn say. We have a policy and it has some form of equity called out. But as far as our collective vision, where we're committed to that, when we say vision, like that's the lens by which we do our work. We're kind of in that middle place, right? We're somewhat effective, would you say? Okay. Yeah, jump in, Phil.
So when you use the word lens, here's what lens says to me. It's a way to distort what I'm looking at. So it either makes things bigger or makes little things able to see, or it corrects your vision. So the word lens is not a positive word for me. Okay.
I'll give a little context to the word lens. And sometimes I just go like physical, right? Like if I take my glasses off right now, it's kind of blurry. Okay. And this is how equity work is. If I don't have a clear definition of what equity is, I don't have a lens for it, then what happens is I don't really see it. I'm not really using that clarity to be able to address some of the issues, right? Student achievement is called out here. So when I put my glasses on, even though I think I need a new prescription, by the way, but the reality is this, that I have clarity and it is now a different vision. So I hear what you're saying, because also what it does is it can create some exposure to things I didn't know, which could be negative, but also it is important that we not have blind spots and it be blurry and not clear, but that we have clear vision on where we're going. And we absolutely have goals to get us to that point. Does that help a little bit, Phil?
So the lens is the same as data?
Data is actually a different characteristic on here we're going to get to, but data is one way to help us be clear on what our vision is. Absolutely. Absolutely. So that will go with number 4. We'll talk about that in a moment. Okay. So just kind of thinking about it. There's no right or wrong answer, but these are the things we have to think about. Do we have a common vision? Second one, do we have strong shared beliefs and values about equity for students and their ability to learn? Again, beliefs. Now this is mindset. This is core values. Okay, do we have a common, strong, shared belief and values about equity for students and their ability to learn, and also the system and its ability to teach our children? So do we have strong shared beliefs about our kids learning and about the system that we happen to oversee in terms of it being able to teach our kids? So this goes to our belief system. Core values. Where do you think you are as a board? This is a tough one. This is where we want to have these dialogues. What is our common belief about our kids learning? And I'm gonna go back to Phil's piece again, like, do we actually know what learning even looks like, what learning means? What does that mean to us? Do we all have, like Jen said, do we all have the same understanding of even what equity is for students? And this is why this assessment is so important, because if we don't have the answer, this is where we go into our study sessions 2 and 3 and 4, where this is where we're going to unpack these. I'm going to move to the third one. Do we have a collaborative relationship with the staff? Okay, this is a huge one in terms of, and the community, and do we establish strong communication, that structure to inform and engage both the internal and external stakeholders? So you have staff, you have teachers, you have administrators, and you also have your students, your parents, you have your community partners. Do you have a strong communication and collaborative process as a governance team to address equity gaps in the district?
I feel that I feel stronger about being able to answer this one, that there are more communication structures in place and people being heard.
Good. Yeah, and that's important with racial equity work. This is a basic structure that has to be in place. Communication is huge. How do we message this work? How do we collaborate with our community's stakeholders, especially those that have the least amount of power? So that's an important one. I appreciate that, Jim. Let's keep going. Our school board is accountability driven, spending less time on operational issues and more time focused on equity and policies to improve student achievement. How do you feel with that?
I feel like we could do better on that. I feel like just from reading the Lighthouse studies, and it always says 2/3 should be dedicated to issues of student achievement. And I feel like that's something we should, first of all, look at, you know, just what amount of time are we spending on each piece?
Absolutely.
Just using the data. And then if we're not doing that, what can we do to get to that point?
Yeah, appreciate that, Carolyn. Yeah, the operational, this is also code for staying in our lanes. We're going to talk about the role of the board, the role of the superintendent, and sometimes that gets messy too. But sometimes this is about, like, where do we need to get in the weeds at, right? As a board member, do we need to go in the weeds where that's the superintendent's role, the staff role? Especially, and this is important because with racial equity work, a lot of this is going to be generated out of our passion for this work. We want to do the right thing and we think we're being helpful, and we forget about the structures that need to be in place to make sure this work is as smooth as possible. We're very clear on whose role is what, so that we're not overlapping and actually getting in the way of our own work. So it's really important to think about this, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. But being accountability driven, like we're telling ourselves, like, hey, like, look, this is not my role. There's an issue, a community member says, you know, they call you up, they send you an email, and they're concerned about something that's operational in nature, and you want to help, right? You want to listen to your community members and you want to help. But maybe sometimes that is something that actually you say, hey, superintendent, I got a call, and let superintendent deal with that, right? Sometimes as board members, we're passionate about things and we have great intentions, but sometimes we'll overlap. And I'll give you an example and another visual of how that looks. But operational things, right? Things that the board should be involved with, things that the board should really allow the staff to do, right? And that's really important. This is where we're going to talk later about prioritizing our work, right? What is most important as a governance team?
Nicole, if I can just chime in on that, Nicole. I would just say, you know, looking at it from the superintendent's perspective, this board is especially mindful and respectful of understanding and knowing the fine line between operational and governance. And obviously that's something that I really appreciate. But saying that being said, I do agree with Carolyn that, you know, as a superintendent and, you know, that I can do a better job and we can do a better job as the administrative team of increasing that focus on academic issues and issues of achievement gaps and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said. Appreciate that. Yeah.
If I could just hop in for a second, also agreeing with Carolyn and Scott, I would also say I'm just coming onto my 6th year now, and I've seen so much improvement in recent years, especially since Scott joined us but to me, it felt like we were oftentimes in positions of needing to be reactive in terms of policy change or whatever discussions were on board agendas. And I think the governance calendar that we have and sort of the scheduled policy updates, I think there's a lot that we have been doing the last 4 or so years that's helping what I see as a trajectory towards being more effective in this area.
Yeah.
I know there's room for growth and improvement.
Yeah.
And there are, yes, there are going to be things, well, there were things like bonds and, the things that took away from
those,
the
yeah.
minutes devoted to academic
Absolutely.
outcomes. But I just wanted to put in that I do see that this board and the superintendent have put a lot of intention towards
Excellent.
improving in the area, but there's always room for growth.
Yeah, good to hear. It sounds like you're pretty effective on this. And every board can't say this. So I want to just say that this is a really important assessment. That every board does not have that feeling of we're effective in this area. And obviously we always have room to grow, but it's really great to hear because this is a huge foundation for being able to prioritize equity work because it will add another layer to how we, really do governance. So I want to kind of whip through these last ones. So this data savvy piece, number 5. So our school board is data savvy. We embrace and monitor quantitative and qualitative data, even when the information is negative, and we use it to drive continuous improvement to close equity gaps. So this is that data one. This is Phil's favorite one right here. So I'm gonna ask Phil where do you think you all are on this one? You're data savvy. You use both qualitative and quantitative to drive your focus.
So we have LCAP item at every one of our meetings.
Tell me what that means though, when you talk about data savviness. Tell me what that means, LCAP item at every meeting.
Well, even narrative is data. And so when you start adding up all the initiatives and projects and things that we're doing, they come out to the sum total is going to be an improvement. And when it's targeted, then we expect that targeted effort should manifest some kind of improvement.
Got it. Tell me a little more, and this is anybody, just jump in. Tell me more about the data, because this one calls out quantitative and qualitative, which means that you look at your obviously your SBAC and you have your district assessments and you have some achievement and discipline data around students. But also there's the qualitative, which is harder to analyze because this is people's feelings. This is the experiences. This is what we see. These are the observations. This is the survey data. So how does that look for you when you look at data as a board?
I feel we get the complete package. It's not hidden from us. We get to read all of it, the surveys of administrators, the surveys of that go out to families. And I feel Scott and the team are really transparent about the areas of growth that people articulate with regards to leadership. So it's always hard to kind of, there's often you hear things that can be challenging to read, and but it's better to read those as opposed to have that hidden from you. So I never feel that as a board that any of that's hidden from us, and we do have that transparency.
Yeah, excellent. That's great to hear. And this data piece is probably one where we talk about how do we improve. Is really as you start to do racial equity work, you'll find that there's data you don't have, even if you wanted to, right? If you wanted to say, hey, Scott, can you provide this? And it's kind of we don't really collect that data yet. And that's what happens with this type of work is there's going to be things you don't know, and that in the system we normally don't collect. And it's not that you don't do surveys. It's not that you don't observe. It's the questions you ask to get the data you want to get. So that's going to be the difference around how do we look at our data savviness. And so this is a really important one. Number 6, our school board aligns, monitors, sustains resources such as equity-focused professional development to meet district goals. So this is about your resources, because you also oversee, you are a fiscally responsible board and you align your resources. We monitor them, we sustain the things that are going to support equity work. And the example pulled out here is professional learning, because this is where your budget falls in, obviously. You know that 85, 90% of your budget is people. So that other small amount of the budget, how do we align the resources? Obviously LCAP gives you some guidance on that, but where do you all think you are in that piece around aligning, monitoring, and sustaining resources to focus on meeting your district goals around equity? Go ahead, Phil.
So we, like every school district, do a LCAP and that whole LCFF and Common Core thing. And so we're all aligned to that. And that is pretty much tells us what we have to do. We're actually constrained by that.
Tell me more. That's intriguing.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. Say more about what you mean by that.
So when you talk about achievement gap, what we're talking about is moving a student into a grade they're not ready for. And we do that on a regular basis. And that's expected of us, of every district in California.
Yeah.
So it should be merit promotion, and then we eliminate the gap, but we're not going to do that.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I hear you on that. And you're unpacking some deeper issues that we got to unpack in kind of the system, right? Is how we measure student success is something the board's gonna have to wrestle with. Is that we are constrained by what student success is. We matriculate kids, right, based on school years and just based on child development, especially with elementary kids, right? Is that their rate of success might look different. The pace of success looks different, but we still go to first grade, go to second grade, go to third grade. And things like reading, right, are really important, right? By third grade, we want them to be literate. And the reality is every kid doesn't meet that benchmark by third grade, but it doesn't mean they can't be successful moving forward. So a lot of times we move kids along, and as Phil said, they're not ready, but then we also have kind of a mindset that's built around success. And so our resources are going to be important to think about as a board. How do we have, again, go back to number 5, the data to help inform our decisions around where we allocate our resources and interrogate some of the systemic structures that actually have created inequities in themselves. And so that's going to be a big one. And your budget is going to have to reflect where are your priorities around equity. And that's going to be a harder one. So this is a tough one because that LCAP and LCFF and any kind of state and federal kind of structures that guide our work, sometimes we are constrained to that. But there are some boards that are being very innovative and thinking outside of the box, even with the constraints that come with some of the nuances of public education. That's a great one to call out. Yeah, jump in, Scott.
Just a little 2 cents on this. I like the way you painted is that, we have, if you think of the pie graph and our budget, almost all of it, goes to human resources. And that small sliver we have to make decisions on. And just one positive example, we certainly don't have it all figured out, but we allocated some of that slim amount of resources we have to a ELD teacher on special assignment this year. And it's because we know we have these opportunity gaps and achievement gaps with that particular group of students, of English learners. And so that is, I think, one area where we did put our money where our mouth is equity-wise, for an example.
Yeah, excellent. And I think what's powerful about that is that you can monitor the impact of that person, right? So you spent money on this person, you can actually follow the impact of not only that person, but the system that person is impacting. Because the reality is that there is a reason why you allocated that money. And I think a lot of times what happens is as educators, not just governance teams, as educators, often we will throw money at an issue and we don't monitor the impact of it. So we never actually know, did it work? And then what happens is is year or two later, when the budget is now cut, you have to make some adjustments. You might say, you know what, this is an auxiliary position, right? We got to let this one go. And then because we didn't monitor the impact of this person's role, they may have been making a phenomenal impact on kids and we never measured it. So then we cut the position, and then what do? We cut our equity vision too, right? So that's why it's really important that as a governance team, you do measure the impact. And it's just very simple kind of things. As a board member, you can ask these questions of the staff, right? And it could be quarterly, right? It could be monthly if you want to really go there. But the reality is that you have to ask the question. And there's nothing wrong with preparing Scott and his staff to say, hey, every quarter, can you just give us an update on like what's the impact of this dollar amount, this resource that we allocated towards this. A lot of time board members, just kind of like, yeah, this is a great idea, but we kind of lose it. And with all the initiatives that are happening, it's not hard to lose something like that. So I think it's a great example, Scott, that you gave. And I just encourage you all to think about how this is important, that you really monitor and then again, sustain. If it's working, then we want to keep it going. We want to replicate those practices. We don't want to get rid of them when the budget gets a little tight, because it will, you all know, it's always tight. It's never adequately funded. So we have to prioritize. And so I appreciate that. The last two I want to talk about and then kind of move forward to our last kind of big conversation is I want to talk to you about this thinking around being a united team, working with your superintendent, making sure that you understand each role, each of your respective roles. And you kind of talked about that earlier, that you do a pretty good job of that when we talked about the operational piece. But having that strong mutual equity focus and that collaboration is important. So this is really critical, even when you all meet individually with Scott, right? When obviously you meet collectively as a board here, that you all have that, go back to number one, that common vision, number two, common beliefs. But this is where you work together as a united team. Because here's what's going to happen again, is that there are going to be some challenges that come up that are going to challenge each of you. It will challenge Scott, because as a superintendent, his role is to do a whole lot besides just work with the board, right? But what will happen is with racial equity, it is going to interrupt some comfort levels. And there will be pushback. There will be questions from the community. And we have to make sure we're united in this work, because if we start to fall apart when the barriers come, then what happens is the board doesn't have superintendents back, right? I literally have seen this happen in front of me as a consultant. It hurt my heart, because at the end of the day, we talked outwardly as a board, and I'm not going to say names of districts, but it's happened in multiple spaces, by the way. We talk about equity as a board, and then we start to do the work, it starts to get messy, right? People get uncomfortable and everyone's not on the same page, and it takes time to bring people to this. And what happens is there's pushback from the community, political pressure, and next thing we know, that it's now put on that superintendent, or it's put on a particular board member. But it's how do we unite as a team so that we really move this work forward? And that collaboration together is going to be important, especially when it gets tough. So this is where this piece, the spirit of this comes from, is united is not just about we all get along. It's about we're united even in the midst of when we're not getting along, even when the challenges come. That's going to be big. So this is one where I want you to be reflective about, and you don't have to answer it today, because this is really going to be one that's going to come very soon as you start to interrupt the system and create some discomfort for folks. Now, this last one is our school board takes part in team development, which is what you're doing tonight, right? And you do some equity focused training. That's what the study sessions are for. Sometimes with your superintendent, and sometimes not. Sometimes it's the board members have to have your own time, right, to be able to wrestle with your role as board. But I always say, do this with your superintendent most of the time, because that's how the work has to happen. There's two roles in this. And if you do it separately, there's value in that, right? Superintendents need to be with superintendents, right? But there's also great value in the governance team learning together, creating a culture of learning, so that, again, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the governance team of SoCal still has a culture of learning together. That's a really important piece. This is how you keep your values, your commitments at the forefront. That's how you don't lose them. This is where the awareness stays at the forefront and you don't lose it when the wind blows, right? So professional learning awareness is huge. Now, what does all this mean, these 8 characteristics? Well, based on the research, the effective governance teams, this is how you close equity gaps, right? So this is a great assessment tool that I would recommend you think about, either, when you actually do your assessment once a year, throw it in as part of your discussion. I know you have your own tool, which is fine. This is not to replace it. This is just more about an equity focus, okay? So it's really helpful. Sometimes you just may want to take one of those and just unpack it. That number 1 is a study session alone, right? Just vision, right? Number 5 is a study session alone, being data savvy. So this is a really powerful one to use to really assess where are we as an effective team. Go ahead, Phil.
When you used the phrase equity focused, my understanding is that our LCAP has to be race neutral, that that's understood that it's an equity LCAP and an educational program.
Well, Phil, you have uncovered the one thing that I am very passionate about is I agree. The LCFF was, the spirit of that was inequity, right? It was all about equity, that we're gonna shift our resources to the kids who need it the most. The problem with it is what I see that you just said, is it calls out 3 groups of kids specifically: English learners, foster youth, and students with who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. It does not call out ethnicity and race. And so there's legislation that has been pushed over and over. I think Congresswoman Dr. Shirley Weber has attempted, has attempted to pass legislation that calls out how do we use those supplemental dollars to ensure that we address the needs of, she called out African American kids, and also was trying to call out kids who identify as Latino and Latina, right? And so what happens is that did not get very far, as I suspect with any race advancing of racial equity groups. Unfortunately, that pushback is not uncommon. However, I will say this, is that the reality is that when you look at your data, there's going to be some clear indications of race. And you have to start, again, being data savvy with collecting that data, and also leveraging LCAP where you can, but also leveraging where there are moments in time where you can actually support kids based on some things that you don't have to call it out because it's not allowing you to call it out. But when you do things like, we're going to do social emotional learning for kids around trauma-informed, trauma-informed care. Well, translation, who's been oppressed, right? Who's been traumatized? Like, who are those children? Typically, they're kids who fall under racial identification, but they also fall under kids who have been in poverty, right? Kids who maybe don't speak the dominant language of English, which intersects with other spaces. So there are some ways to call out race that I think when you talk about budget, you'd have to be very careful with LCAP. But the reality is that you know your children and you know what's best for them. And what we often talk about is leverage the policies and the legislation, but we also talk about you have to really understand how to be creative, knowing the constraints that come with legislation. And we're going to talk about the history of public education in a minute to give a great example. But thank you, Phil, for that, because I agree. This is going to be our challenge. This is going to be the work we have to do as a governance team. Now, in the end, what do governance teams, like what is the outcome that governance teams have? Equity-driven governance teams have a policy, okay, an equity policy, which I think Scott shared in the chat. They have an equity statement, which goes back to what Phil said is, well, we haven't really defined when you say racial equity, what do you mean? So that tells me, like, and as a stakeholder, as a school district, there's common language that still has to be developed. So part of why you create an equity statement, and if you want to go into a racial equity statement, you have to call it out. What is it? So that you actually can have, again, go back to a lens for how we govern. So when I say I want to make a decision, how am I applying my equity lens based on our statement? What do we call out as equity? So that's going to be the work we're going to do with you as a governance team over these study sessions, is to work with you on, even if you have a draft statement or you have something written in the policy, we still have to make it our own, right? So it's not enough to have the policy, you have to own it and know it, right? You should know it. And then also we got to get feedback from others who maybe can help us identify what equity is. Because often we identify it for someone else and it actually is not what they need. And so ultimately we want to be really informed. And so having a statement, having a policy, last but not least, having a plan. So while LCAP is, every district in California has an LCAP, not sure how many pages yours is. Let me take a guess, Scott. Let me see if I can get it right. Your LCAP is 120 pages.
I'm gonna defer to Jessica on that one.
It's about closer to 180.
Oh, I was close. You know, I almost went for like 150. I should have went with my first gut. So my point of this is this, that LCAP is a compliance tool that every district has to have. LCAP is typically 180 pages and more. Like the bigger the districts are, you can imagine more pages a lot of times. And I joke with you, but in all seriousness, it's really hard to take a 180-page document and say, this is how I'm going to govern, right? I don't know how many of you actually read all 180 pages. I know you had to go through it, but you haven't memorized the LCAP. What we want you to think about is an equity impact plan. Every board governance team should have a plan focused on equity. And what we encourage you to think about is pick an equity gap that you are wanting to close and focus on that. And in that plan, you actually have data you're collecting. You have action steps that you're going to actually focus on, and stay focused on that, right? Because ultimately you can't do everything. So we talk about have a plan to do one thing good. And I kid you not, if you close one racial equity gap, you're probably going to close a whole lot of other gaps in the process. So I want you to think about having a plan that just keeps you all laser focused on the work, right? It drives some of your questions, and it's really, it's feasible. It's not so overwhelming. But if you don't have a plan, then you won't do it. It's just kind of how it goes, right? You won't do it. And that's with anything, right? If we don't have a plan, it ain't happening. So we're going to help walk you through all of these. And I will give you examples of other boards in California who are working at this. It's a work in progress. It's not an overnight process. It's a struggle, but the struggle is to understand first before we start trying to plan. So I want to make sure that's really clear. Yep, jump in, Phil.
Okay, so we still haven't defined racial equity, but I will tell you what I see when I see that phrase, and that is I need to sort my students by race and then come up with an educational plan for each one of those races, because we're not talking about just one or two races. We're talking about all races, right?
Well, Phil, that's a great question. Part of what we're going to walk you through is how do you all define it? And your individual definition is going to be important, but also collectively. I don't want to define it for you. I'll give you a little context, and we're definitely going to share over our study sessions. But I will say this, the reason why we don't start off with equity first, we start off with governance first, is because we actually can't attack and really address racial equity and the complexity of it if we don't have effective governance practices in place. So we are going to define it, which is why that's one of the outcomes. And I think that's going to be important over time that you all be thinking about, what does this mean? We got to deconstruct the concept of race in itself, right? Like that in itself. And how do we identify our students who mark boxes, right, in the data around race? How do we ensure that we address all students who don't identify with any of the boxes that we want to give them? So this is really important to think about. But I want you to make sure you recognize we can't effectively do equity governance work without effective governance practices. So that's big. So here's what I want to do as we transition. I want to give you a couple of resources that we're going to go through in our next study session. So we're going to continue to always talk about effective governance. Every time we meet, we're going to continue to go back to this. This is just an image that we share around the roles of superintendent, role of board members. So this is always a good reminder when you all are doing your check-ins, like where are we at? How are we doing? Right, there's that dotted line for a reason, that sometimes we do have to cross each other's lanes, right? We have to collaborate, but reality is we have established roles, that the role of the board is to adopt policy, to evaluate the outcomes, and obviously create the vision, right? Create the goals, which you've done an awesome job. Even us being here tonight, and you having your racial equity task force, having your admin team engage in this work. That's the vision, right? That I heard Scott say in the beginning. But also then there's the role of superintendent, and Scott's probably like, you don't have enough things under there. I think that's not sharing what I really do. But overall, there's the actually developing a plan based on the vision of the board. It's actually implementing the plan. It's monitoring the plan and really working with the board to be updated on here's the progress that we have towards this work. So that's a great reminder about roles in this work, because again, it gets very messy when we start to address racism. Another example, and this is just another slide that we've shared before, is just what does good governance look like? So these are all just great reminders, some of the things that came up for you. I'm not going to go through them all, but these are just things to think about around what good governance looks like. Very important to be solid in this so that you can address racial equity. All right. So again, this is all in the slides for you, so I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but this is just an example. Also want to share something that's important about equity-driven governance teams is prioritizing the work. You're going to hear me say that a lot. You're going to hear Dr. Holt say it a lot. You're going to hear us push back sometimes when you all get super excited about this work. You're already passionate about it, but there are going to be moments that you're going to start to be more aware of certain research-based practices, certain things that will be great for your kids that you maybe haven't explored yet. And we're going to always go back to prioritize your work, right? And the way we'll talk about it is through the fact that governance teams, you operate through policy. So often what bubbles to the top of effective governance teams that focus on equity is policy that's around curriculum, instruction, funding, and discipline. Now, is that to say facilities and technology isn't important? No, it's not saying that at all. What it's saying is prioritizing your policy work so that you can measure the impact of what you're doing. If you have 20 things on this list, 30 things on this list, which you actually can have, I'm sure Scott can write them all up in a PowerPoint for me and show all the different policies we have, all the initiatives. But if you don't prioritize the work, then what happens is it gets lost. So the things that are really important when you look at data and you look at where those equity gaps, they're going to show up in discipline. They're going to show up in how we fund and share and allocate resources to our kids who need it the most. And they're going to show up in instruction, right? How teachers teach, curriculum, what are we using to teach, right? And you're going to see that those are always going to be those things that you have to think about prioritizing. And if it doesn't fall in these categories, you have to kind of make a decision. Is this something I need to spend time asking the superintendent about today? Is this something that can wait? Is this something that maybe I need to ask more questions about because I'm really concerned and it's one of our priorities? But this really helps you to think about equity-driven boards, really stay focused on the things that are most critical, okay? And these are the things that should bubble up to you as a board, okay? Things like, and I'm gonna use a landscaping example, that you have a community member is very concerned about how many palm trees are planted in front of Soquel Elementary School. I'm just making this up, by the way. But this is very real. There are people concerned about the landscaping and believe that this is an issue. When you have a bond measure passed, that comes up as well, our facilities. And in the end, you have to make a decision. Is this a priority? Is it going to affect teaching and learning? And if it doesn't, then you have to kindly say, thank you for that. We're gonna look into it. It is important, but it's not the same priority. And you have to, so this is how we kind of prioritize our time and our energy. Our board meetings need to be succinct around this. When you all have finding yourselves having really long board meetings, sometimes you go back to this, like, are we prioritizing what is most critical that we need to spend our time on? And that's a really important piece when equity starts to come up, because other people are going to start to get very much excited about this work and want to add to your plates. They're going to want to say, hey, this is equity and this is equity. We call it picking up a bunch of rocks, right? Here's an equity rock. Here's another equity rock. Next thing you know, they got all these equity rocks they want you to take care of. And it's like, oh, we can only prioritize so much. We want to be good at it. Now, some of the things you would see on this slide, which I'm not going to go deep into, but these again are just those practices that that you want to keep in mind. Again, working collectively. This is how you prioritize your work. Making sure that budget is really providing what is needed to address equity gaps. And of course, your role as a board is to create policies, adequate policies that address equity gaps. Okay, so we're going to unpack all of those in our study sessions. Okay, and we're going to help you kind of see how do you prioritize. These are, I'm not going to go through these, but these are going to be some things we'll talk about questions with purpose. A lot of times board members have lots of questions that they want to ask the staff, questions they want to ask the superintendent. And it's important with equity work, again, you prioritize it, that your questions should be aligned with your priorities. So when you think about it, we're spending a lot of agenda time on things that aren't part of our priorities. This is where we go back to, well, what questions are we really asking, right? What are the things that are really going to advance our work? So these are really helpful just to think about questions that you may consider asking. And we're going to go through these together. We're going to have some scenarios that we'll do together and talk about how do we ask questions based on data that's going to be presented and based on what you need as a governance team to make sound decisions that are equitable. Phil had asked a question about, well, what is this racial equity thing all about, right? What does it mean? So I'm going to give you an example when we say equity, what this actually may mean to you as a governance team. And I'm giving it to you in the context of, this is a sample definition from the National Equity Project, which is out of Oakland. And in particular, it calls out what equity is in education. Okay, I just want you to take a look at it and start to think about what resonates with you. Let me give you a chance to read through it. And Scott, just doing a quick time check. I know we started a few minutes late because of the Zoom transition. Doing a quick time check on if we have permission to extend, or I don't know if I should be asking Ted as well. Do we have permission to extend? It was about maybe 10, 15 minutes that we started, but I want to make sure I honor what you all need. And we have 3 study sessions, so this is always going to be a continuation, but I just want to check in.
Is the team okay with 7:45? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
I'm good, and I think everybody else is
Sideways.
Amanda has a sideways thumb up. I'm worried about the sideways thumb.
Well, yeah,
I might leave early. I think I have two very hungry teenagers waiting for me. We're traveling. Nicole, I was just at
Oh.
Oregon State today. We're looking at colleges.
Go
So
Beavs.
go Beavers.
Go Beavs.
But yeah, so we've been on the road
Okay.
all day. So but
No worries.
that if I need to leave a little early, I will excuse myself.
Okay.
Okay.
yeah, by all means.
Okay. And we'll try to make an adjustment, kind of meet you all halfway, because we're getting to the end. And also we don't want to, it's like drinking water from a fire hose sometimes, right? It's a lot in a short period of time. So that's why we have 4 study sessions. All right. So go ahead, Phil, jump in. Uh-oh, you're on mute,
You're
Phil.
muted.
I'm trying to read your lips, but it's not working. You're on mute. There you go.
Okay, so the first bullet here says removing predictability of success. So we should not expect our efforts to have any success.
That's a great one. Phil, you're always reading my mind somehow.
I'm just reading the slide.
Yeah. So here's the reality, Phil, is that equity work is really centered around ensuring that all kids have equally high outcomes. And what we find in the data is that kids who identify based on race, culture, socioeconomic factors, that often in the data we find that we can predict success or failure in schools. And it's trend data that's been showing up for centuries, actually, in education. And I would say more recently, decades in education. And so you can almost predict what kids are going to have higher graduation rates. You're going to predict what kids achieve higher on a test. And so when we say remove the predictability, that means that we are going to be interrupting some structures that actually have created those barriers. And recognize that I shouldn't be able to go to any district in California and pick kids who look like mine, by the way. If I was a parent and I wanted to pick a district to say, where do I want to pick a district where I know African-American kids thrive in academics? Well, I can predict that majority of the districts, I don't know if I can find one. And that's not because African-American kids aren't brilliant. It's because there's a system that is structured in a way to not really identify that brilliance. And that's where we talk about the history of public education. So how do we interrupt the predictability that I can say, hey, an English learner that I can't predict that they're not going to be successful based on those metrics we have in school. So that's what that's about, is removing the predictability and really understanding that we change how we serve kids in the system, and that we should not be able to predict who does well in school and who doesn't, which unfortunately we can feel at this point in time. And it's been like that for a while. The system issue, definitely. It's definitely not our kids are not brilliant. So I love that you call that out. What else is sticking out to y'all for equity in education?
Interrupting.
Interrupting. Tell me more.
I mean, going back to even the article, the water systems of change, and like recognizing the system you're in, and things that maybe you're doing all the time, like you have a school handbook that you've never really looked at, or a dress code policy, and that's not the case in our district. Those are just the general ones, because we go through our handbooks. Practices that may even seem small to some people, in how students are greeted or compared to their siblings who they had, who, you know, just the recognizing and stopping.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, interrupting inequitable practices, and that's an intentionality, right? Like this is talking about what does this look like in action, is we're interrupting, we're examining some things that may not be serving kids well. And that requires some data collection. It requires some real intentionality about including a different, like that word inclusive comes up, right, a lot. And how does that look in our curriculum, right? How do kids see themselves? Do they relate to the curriculum? Do we have culturally relevant instructional practices? And to say, like, do our teachers even have the support to know how to do that? because it's not enough to say, hey, let's just create equitable practice all of a sudden, right? It goes back to that water system change article. How do we ensure that we're empowering a group of people who may not have the, not only power, but more of the like knowledge base to know, how do I create equity, right? I go back to what's water? Like, I was a teacher in this body of water, and I wasn't given the tools to be able to be equitable as a teacher, even though I feel like I was successful at that time through other avenues that created success, like relationship building, right? Recognizing cultural identity. But there were some things that I didn't have that I think we have to ensure is inequitable in itself. That, do our teachers have the support? Do our teachers have the resources? And that's a really important piece to look at. I don't know if you all caught on to that last bullet point, but it calls out human beings, right? And I think about, when Phil mentioned, like, so are we calling all of our kids out by race? And I mean, we have lots of different races, but for me, it's like, how do we kind of take the race construct even out of the equation? Because race based on history was based on really not giving kids access, right? It was based on kind of dividing groups of kids. So how do we see kids as human beings, right? So that we can define success through who they are versus putting them in a box to say, hey, because you're an English learner, right, who happens to identify as Chinese, that I assume, right, and I put you in a space where I'm going to give you certain resources, and it's based on language and ethnicity, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But as an elementary student, sometimes I need you to give me support based on what I'm interested in, and not based on a stereotype that's associated with who I am, or based on an assumption of what I need. And that's a harder conversation when we talk about human beings. We talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? How do we ensure that equity is applying to all kids because they're human beings? And that's a big piece. Like, every kid needs to feel positive relationships. Every kid needs to feel like their talents and skills are being acknowledged. And we don't do that well in education for any kids, in my opinion. But we know that, unfortunately, in the data, that all kids don't have equally high outcomes. And so that's what we have to talk about, redefining what student success even is in education. And that's a whole nother conversation we'll have. So why am I sharing this with you? One of the things we're going to push you to do in our next study session is to unpack what your definition of equity is. So we're going to be asking you to think about this process of the elephant in the blind man, which is a poem that we often use to help people create their definition of equity. And even though you've passed a policy, what we're going to do is unpack that together so that you all are familiar with it. So I highly suggest that part of your, what I call homework between now and our next session, is to ensure that you actually look at your equity policy, be familiar with it, because it is calling out equity. So that is a policy you pass. So we don't want to start from scratch. You already have kind of a vision around what equity is. So let's visit that. Is what does your equity kind of policy and statement say? And let's keep unpacking it, because the reality is that, like the elephant and the blind man, they're all touching on the elephant, and they all have different perspectives, right? And none of them are saying it's the elephant. They're all saying it's a part of the elephant, right? And so they're all right because they all have a perspective, but they're all wrong because none of them say it's an elephant. And that's part of the struggle of this work, is to really understand, what does equity actually mean in our district? And this is going to require us to ask our stakeholders what they think equity is. It's going to require us to ask parents and students and teachers, community members. That's where the elephant and blind man activity is so powerful. So we're going to talk about that. And so I want to make sure you put on your to-do list is take a look at your policy. Okay, take a look at your policy. So when we come back for our next meeting, our next session, then we're going to unpack what is the definition of equity. When we say equity, this is the common language and understanding. And this again goes back to, this is the lens by which we govern. Okay, so that's why it's important to really get to, do we have a common definition? As Phil said, what does this actually mean? And this is what we're going to unpack, Phil. Go ahead.
So isn't that last bullet the same as differentiated instruction?
The last bullet, people can articulate it in that way, I would say, but I think you'd have to really unpack what you're differentiating for, right? So who are we talking about, right? And I think the spirit of that, absolutely. To differentiate and actually meet the needs of all kids, absolutely. But we'd have to define even differentiate instruction. That means something different depending on who you're talking to. So I think that's important. But I think the spirit of that in that bullet, absolutely. Absolutely. So where are we going next? As we kind of come to a close and as Amanda has to feed hungry teenagers, and I'm just going to say, if they're listening, you should be cooking for your mommy, not the other way around. You can, no, I'm kidding.
We pulled up into an empty rental, so
Yeah,
the cupboards are bare.
I'm just kidding.
I had to say though, I can't stop thinking that last bullet point. I keep thinking about that in terms of staff and teachers, you know, and I get that we're talking about, you know, what equity is defining what our kids get, but really, yeah, to me, it really resonates true in terms of, right, how does the work actually get done? You know, recognizing again, not just that all of the kids are individual, unique humans from, you know, coming from their own perspective. It's like, we've got to see that's, you know, see the opportunities that come from our own staff's experiences and perspectives. And I'm so glad that, again, we've got the task force, that we're getting all of this perspective from all the other folks, because we need it.
Absolutely. I appreciate that so much. And so as I think about like the thought Amanda has, it's like, you're probably thinking, okay, Nicole, you've given us quite a bit in a short period of time. Again, it's like drinking water from a fire hose, right? What does this mean and what's next? So one, what it means is you have more study sessions, right? This is why we recommend that boards engage in multiple study sessions to unpack this work. It is not as easy as it seems. It's not as easy as, hey, tell us the definition and then we'll go do the work. It requires some processing. So what we're going to do as we come back in our study sessions, you may notice the detailed agenda is really going to stay the same. So each time we come together, we're going to always go back to effective governance practices. We're going to talk about more deeply each time prioritizing our work. We're going to talk about what is your definition of racial equity. So we're going to have to make sure we have a common language amongst the board, and through your policy, we can kind of revisit that. And then I want you to be thinking about how we're going to address some of the challenges that are going to come ahead of us. And so I'm going to use this slide to kind of give you a sense of where we're going. This was shared with our task force as well, and just want to make sure you kind of see like the big picture of this work we have to understand. There's a lot of awareness that still has to be built on how do we become an effective governance team that's driven with an equity lens. So we're going to talk in our future sessions more deeply about what does racial equity mean, and really unpack like the differences, right? That it's not equality, it's equity. And it is calling out students of color. We're gonna unpack what students of color means. We're gonna unpack the constructs of race. We're gonna talk about not only defining what it means, but we're gonna talk about the challenges which you see in the middle. And one of our activities we will go through is the history of public education. That in particular is actually in your handouts. So as part of your kind of preparation for our next meeting, because we don't have a lot of time for your study sessions, I would encourage you to look at the history, just kind of take a chance, just take a look. I know Scott has gone through this, Jen has seen it. Just have a lot of breathing that you do when you go through this activity, because there's some things in the history that, again, what's water? Oh my God, I didn't realize that education unfortunately has a history of inequities, and it wasn't designed to be equitable. So we're going to talk about the historical inequities. We're going to talk about some of the barriers around resistance to change, so you can get ahead of what's coming. We're going to talk about implicit bias, one of people's favorite topics, right? Implicit bias, stereotypes. These are all barriers to this work that sometimes become a challenge. So we got to know what they are so we can get ahead of them. And what does this mean as a governance team to address these? And then the last piece in that last column is all tied to your article, Water of System Change. So those of you that didn't get a chance to read through it, this is your opportunity to really unpack those conditions in the system that we have to recognize as a governance team, knowing that we operate at the policy level. So yes, racial equity in education is about changing policies and practices that provide access and opportunity. It is about shifting resources to the kids that need it the most, and calling out kids of color, by the way. But as a governance team, even though you operate at the policy level, you do have to understand below those structures, relationships, the power dynamics, the mental models. Those are all going to be huge in terms of addressing the needs of the system and changing the system for kids who have been harmed in the system. And so that means we got to talk about what is the relationship when we make a decision as a board. How does that fall in terms of relationships with our stakeholders? Are we actually empowering people who don't have a voice when we make decisions? Do we invite certain people to our study sessions to provide context so that when we make decisions, we're not just making it without the perspective of those with the least voice? How do we ensure that we shift mental models? And that's going to be the hardest pieces. People's mindsets, their belief system, the culture, the narrative. Those are all the things that will actually be very hard to address in terms of putting a policy in place and you want it to last. If people don't believe in it, the policy is for what? And that's where you're going to see the history of public education is going to illustrate that very clearly when we talk about segregation, when we talk about policies from the past, that not much has changed. As a matter of fact, in some ways they're worse. And it's not because it wasn't a good policy. It's because the mindset wasn't there. The belief system wasn't there. We didn't make the decision with the people it was going to affect. So this is where we'll have to unpack the systems lens when we act as a governance team, which is really going to be the way that you sustain racial equity work. So I'm super excited about that, and want to give you in between, Scott, I believe, and I don't even have the date right in front of me right this second, but in between our time today and our next study session, I want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to reach out to Dr. Shelley and I, and to make sure you have a chance to really process what we're going to be doing along the way. Sometimes the study sessions are great as a group, but also individually you may have a perspective and questions. So I want you to feel free to reach out to any of us along the way, because this work is really, it's hard. and sometimes we don't understand, and sometimes we just need a quiet place, a place where we're not in public to be able to ask some of those questions that aren't always comfortable in this governance space, right? Because you are obviously, fall under a public team. So you're going to have to do this work in public, which is hard. Dr. Holt, before I close out with a few kind of next steps, please share any thoughts, closing thoughts you have about some of the work that we're going to be doing, some of the things even we shared today.
The main thing will be around, one, the barriers. I know maybe those barriers, and it's late at night, I get it, but please be cognizant as you are even walking through your life right now to some of the language that you will hear that is a barrier to this work. Things like, shouldn't we be doing this for all kids? Why are we singling out children? Things like that, that mentality and that thinking, I'm not asking you to say anything about it, but just know that those barriers are huge as we start to move this work forward, and recognizing, and this is to echo your point, Ms. Jackson, around your staff. We are working with people who are products of the exact system that we are trying to change. We are working with people who are successful products, and I put that in air quotes, of the system that we are moving to change. I am one of them. I was very successful in school, very successful. Couldn't stop me. But it doesn't mean that that system worked for everyone. It doesn't mean that that system was equitable for everyone just because I succeeded. And so just keeping that in mind, that we're going to, exactly what you were saying, Ms. Jackson, this also applies to staff. Real quick, when I became in one of my positions where I had the power, privilege, and authority to make decisions, I was literally brought to tears by the number of staff members who came to me and said, my goodness, for the first time, I think I can talk about the oppression that I've experienced here in the school system. So you'll be surprised by how much the people that you are working with, who we are going to be asking to implement equitable change for the next generation, have been experiencing exactly this and may or may not feel comfortable to talk about it. So I know that that's like kind of a big old weight to put down, but I just want to remind you that this is bigger than just the children. This is, our entire community in many senses, opening up, a Pandora's box or a can of worms. And we've just got to be ready to deal with it. It doesn't mean it can't be dealt with. It doesn't mean it's going to be pretty. It doesn't mean it's not going to be sticky. It just means that together we're going to have to be prepared for what we're dealing with and know that we're moving out in uncharted waters, to say the least. And so I'm very encouraged by the group that we have working here, and I'm excited for this time together. So but just keep in mind, it applies to everyone, not just the children.
Absolutely. Closing thoughts. And I like Dr. Holt often gives this as a prompt when we close out is, I came in feeling and I'm leaving feeling. And so I want to just open that up as we close out. Is I came in feeling and I'm leaving feeling. So maybe an example is I came in feeling anxious about talking about racism, and I'm leaving feeling more comfortable or even safer. Just an example.
Can I jump in?
Okay.
Please.
I came in embracing the 4 agreements, and I'm leaving experiencing non-closure, and I'm loving it.
Yay.
I love that last part. I see you, Jen. Go
love
ahead.
Non-closure. Yes. Thank you, Jen.
I came in willing to learn.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking more leaving confused,
Ah,
but that could be the closure.
so confused, maybe non-closure. So tell me
Yeah.
more about the confused. Like, give me more. Is it just things that you still are trying to wrestle with, things that you still want to understand?
Basically, my mind is still struggling with the definition of equity and equality.
Got it.
And I have to always go back to that picture from CSBA to really understand what it is, because to me, it's kind of, I think of it as almost the same meaning, which is not, too. And then just a lot of points. I mean, a lot of, you brought up a lot of interesting, some great stuff. It's just that, in a way I don't know, we have 3 other sessions, so we'll see what happens, but I'm just kind of confused about equity and equality, where to go with the board and so on and so forth.
Got it. Got it. Thank you, Ted, for that.
You got to use smaller words for me. Talk to me like I'm a 6-year-old.
Yeah, there are some complex terms with this, and so
Yeah, I was sitting here looking up the definition of some of these words while you were talking. So
yeah, yeah, and we're gonna do that. I appreciate that,
Yeah.
Ted. Some of this is complex. Just simplify it, right? Because it is a lot.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead, Amanda. Jump in, because I know those teenagers are like, "Mom, really?"
But I'm not good with 2-word things. But I guess I came in with some trepidation, little nervousness, and I'm leaving encouraged.
Good. Got it.
So I came in anxious and I still am.
Ah, got it.
Good.
I came in unsure, and I'm leaving hopeful.
Good. Got it. All right, who I missed? Scott, jump in.
Came in hopeful and leaving encouraged, especially just by the amount of dialogue that the board gets to have, kind of in a context that they don't always get the opportunity to, because we're so structured, by board meetings. So that was enjoyable for me.
Got it. Excellent. Thank you for that.
We have Linda and Michelle.
I came in feeling curious, and I'm leaving feeling excited to see what comes next.
Michelle, Jessica, go ahead.
Go with I came in with an openness and leaving. It's hard to say right now. I'm sorry. my brain is full. I guess maybe that's how I'm leaving, with a very full
That's it.
Yeah. Got it. Powerful. Jessica, go ahead.
Jessica,
I came in feeling excited, and I'm leaving feeling impatient.
Got it. Powerful. George, you want to jump in? George is like, you're always picking on me.
I came in feeling confused by there being 2 Zoom links. And then I'm leaving feeling really grateful that the district is doing this work. So.
Yeah. No, that's powerful. Appreciate that, George. I think we got everybody. Yes. Okay. Good. And I'll say, Dr. Holt, why don't you go? How'd you come in feeling? How do you feel leaving out?
I'll be honest, I came in off of that policing thing just on one because it was very intense. Let's just say, whenever you start talking about police and Black girls and showing videos and such. So it was very much here, like, whoa, what's going on? What are we gonna need to tackle today? And I'm leaving really feeling encouraged because one of the things that those final statements that folks were saying at that session was that boards aren't interested in this work and boards aren't doing this work. And I had the pleasure of being able to say, I need to leave early because I'm going to go and support a board who is doing this work. And so I'm very encouraged by this because when you see this on a national level, or even, and obviously I'm in a different state, born and raised there, but in a different state. And when you see on a national level that people are saying, please, let's do this work. And folks are going, and you have the kids, these were college kids I was talking to, and they said, they were really kind of saying, well, nobody's going to do it. And I was so excited to be able to say, no, I'm leaving right now to go talk to a board who is doing this work right now as we speak. And so just know that you have an entire army of people behind you as you productively struggle through this. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to always leave with a nice little bow, but we will get through it together.
Yeah, and I'll end with kind of the 4 agreements as I came engaged, and I'm leaving with what I call non-closure because I know that there's a lot of work to be done, and it's always nice to get a kind of an assessment of where you are as a governance team. And my non-closure is that I know there's lots of work to be done with you, and as a facilitator, I'm really anxious to ensure that you have what you need at the pace and the readiness of the board. And I just am excited. I'm adding an extra word, maybe because I'm a facilitator, I get to add an extra word, but I'm excited too. I'm leaving excited. And just want to thank you, Scott. Thank you, Ted, and everyone here for your vision, for your intentionality, and on a late night, right? Where I know you all are exhausted and you really are doing some phenomenal work, even with this. There are a lot of boards who are not having this discussion. And we're just like chipping away at the beginning stages, right? There's so much more we're going to do. So I'm just excited and thankful. And I'm going to pass the virtual mic over and make sure that you all don't get complete Zoom exhaustion before 8 o'clock. Thank you all.
And we put our stuff.
Thank you.
I just want to let you all know we put our I know I put my information and you have Nicole's information in the chat. For those of you who are experiencing levels of non-closure, please feel free to reach out. That's what we are here for. So feel free to text or give a call, and we can kind of talk through some of that before our next session if we need to. We don't want you to sit with that unnecessarily if you don't have to.
Thank you, Dr. Holt. And Nicole, just on a real practical level, I had sent you some potential dates. So I don't think we have an agreed one on the calendar yet, but as soon as you and I get to cross-reference those, I will get them out to the board ASAP.
Sounds good. I'll take a look.
And I will pass that virtual mic over to President Donnelly now to wrap things up.
All right, well, thank you for that huge presentation there. Lot to go on, as I will call for an adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn the meeting for tonight?
I'll make it. Oh,
I'm thinking about you, Amanda.
Thank you. Jen made it all second.
Yeah, Jen got the SoCal Square first and your SoCal Square second. So Jen first, Amanda second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I guess everybody's in favor. All right. Have a good night, everybody. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.